They weren't just siblings, they were lovers who built an empire on blood. It began on a night drenched in silence, where the only sound was the hiss of wind against stone castle walls. Candles flickered nervously in the long corridors, as if the fire itself feared what was about to unfold. Behind a locked chamber door, a secret was sealed, a brother and sister, bound not by chance but by hunger for power, whispered vows never meant to be spoken. The world outside believed in honor and tradition and the purity of royal blood. But inside those walls, purity twisted into something darker. They told themselves it wasn't love, it was survival. Their dynasty was crumbling, enemies circling like wolves, and the only way to preserve power was to keep it within the family. To outsiders, they appeared as dutiful heirs. But in shadows, their bond crossed the line between loyalty and sin. And then came the first rumor. A servant, passing the hall too late at night, swore she heard the sound of laughter, not the innocent laughter of siblings, but the hushed giggles of intimacy. She fled, her footsteps echoing down the cold stone floors, knowing what she had heard could topple an empire. But by morning she was gone. Some whispered she left, others whispered she was silenced. From that day, silence became the family's deadliest weapon. Guards were replaced, doors were watched, and every whisper in the castle carried the weight of a death sentence. But the rumors didn't die, they multiplied. Markets buzzed with talk of strange closeness, priests muttered warnings of sin, and old women in the villages swore they'd seen omens in the sky. A crow that would not leave the chapel roof. Blood-red storms over the harvest. A curse waiting to be born. But to the siblings, none of it mattered. They believed they were untouchable, chosen by fate, destined to rule at any cost. Their secret wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. Every smile they shared in public masked a pact written in shadows. Every feast they hosted was a distraction from the truth behind the curtains. And when the sister finally placed her hand over her stomach one night, trembling as she whispered the words, "I carry our future," the air in the room turned heavy, as though the walls themselves recoiled. What none of them knew was this: the very bloodline they tried to preserve would soon betray them. They weren't just siblings, they were lovers. Some secrets are born screaming. Blood was the price of power. If you discovered this secret in your family, would you expose it or protect it to the grave? In the cold daylight, the siblings wore masks of dignity. A brother who spoke like a prince, a sister who carried herself like a queen, untouchable, respected, almost divine. But when the court dispersed and the feasts ended, their eyes betrayed a hunger that no crown could hide. Why did they cross that forbidden line? Some say it was lust, others desperation. But in truth, it was something far darker: control. They were heirs to a dynasty already cracking at its edges. Powerful families waited like vultures, hopping to claim the throne through marriage alliances. A single wrong step, a marriage to the wrong partner, and the dynasty would collapse. So the siblings asked themselves, why trust outsiders when we can keep everything in our own hands? It was more than survival, it was obsession. The brother whispered that no one else was worthy of their blood. The sister agreed, swearing that only by merging their destinies could their family remain immortal. To them, it wasn't sin, it was sacrifice. A noble sin committed for the greater good. But fate is never fooled. One autumn evening, while the castle bells rang in celebration of a harvest festival, a priest noticed something strange. He watched the siblings exchange a glance, a look too sharp, too lingering. His heart froze. He turned away quickly, whispering a prayer under his breath, "Lord, protect us from cursed unions." And yet it was already too late. The siblings had staged their own private ceremony in secret. Not before God, not before witnesses, but before the silence of the night itself. No vows written, no rings exchanged, only whispered promises, sealed with trembling hands in the dark. The morning after, nothing appeared unusual. The kingdom carried on, soldiers trained, peasants toiled, and merchants sold their goods. But inside the castle, the siblings lived with a secret heavy enough to crush empires. The whispers grew louder. Some courtiers said the brother refused to look at any suitor. Others claimed the sister fainted during a council meeting, her face pale, her hand drifting to her stomach. The servants exchanged nervous glances, asking the question no one dared to speak aloud. What if the rumors were true? But to the siblings, none of that mattered. They had won, or so they thought, because within months the heir they had longed for was about to be born, and with it, the curse that would haunt their bloodline forever. They chose sin over survival. This wasn't love, this was power. Some secrets are too heavy for crowns to hide. Would you sacrifice morality itself, just to keep your family in power? Winter crept over the kingdom like a shroud. The air turned sharp, the nights longer, and inside the castle, whispers grew colder than the snow piling against the gates. The sister's body began to change, her steps slower, her face paler, her silences heavier. The courtiers pretended not to notice, but their eyes followed her every move. One evening, as she rose from the banquet table, her hand pressed instinctively to her stomach. The hall went silent. Knives paused halfway through roasted meat, goblets froze midair. She forced a smile, excused herself, and vanished into the corridors. Behind her, the whispers began. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was the princess with child? And if so, by whom? Some hoped it was a suitor in secret. Others, more daring, whispered the unthinkable, that the heir in her womb carried the blood of her own brother. But the truth was darker than gossip. The sister's pregnancy was plagued with strange signs. At night, her screams echoed down the stone halls as she clutched her stomach, swearing something inside clawed at her. Candles extinguished without warning in her chamber. Servants swore they heard two heartbeats but not in harmony, one strong, steady, the other broken, uneven, almost unnatural. Midwives were called in, sworn to secrecy. They exchanged uneasy glances, their hands trembling as they checked her pulse. "This is not a normal child," one whispered. By dawn, she was gone, dismissed, or perhaps silenced forever. The brother tried to calm his sister, telling her this was destiny. "Our children will be the proof of our greatness," he promised, even as her eyes filled with dread. But deep inside, he too feared what was growing. He began packing at night, candles burning low, muttering prayers to gods he had once mocked. The omens multiplied. A raven perched on the castle tower and did not move for days. A blood-red moon rose above the kingdom, staining the snow crimson. In the village, a baby was born twisted and lifeless, and the midwives swore it was a warning of what was to come. And then one night, as the sister lay awake, she felt it, two distinct kicks inside her. Twins. She gasped, her breath fogging in the cold air of her chamber. Twins were rare, celebrated as a blessing. But in this case, it felt like a punishment. Because these children would not be born as heirs. They would be born as omens. The womb carried a curse. Two heartbeats, one broken. These weren't heirs, they were omens. If you heard the midwives' warning, would you hide it, or reveal the cursed truth to the kingdom? The castle never forgot that night. The storm began at dusk, a thunder that shook the stone walls, lightning that carved monstrous shadows across the halls. As the sisters' screams echoed through the corridors, servants pressed their hands to their ears, swearing the cries did not sound human. The birthing chamber smelled of blood and burning wax. Candles trembled against the draft, their light too weak to chase the darkness gathering in the corners. The midwives whispered prayers under their breath, each one glancing toward the locked doors as though escape might save them. The brother stood just beyond the bed, his face pale, his hands clenched. Power was all he had ever wanted, and yet in that moment even he seemed shaken. His sister's fingers dug into the sheets, her face twisted in agony as she screamed, "It's tearing me apart." Hours dragged on like centuries. The storm outside grew worse, as though the heavens themselves raged against what was about to be born. Each cry of thunder seemed to answer her screams, shaking the chamber walls. And then silence. The midwives froze. They leaned forward, listening, the sisters' sobs quieted, replaced by a strange sound. A gurgling, rattling cry that did not sound like the first breath of a healthy child, but something else entirely. The first twin was pulled into the world. The midwife gasped, nearly dropping the child. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, its eyes shut tight, its body trembling with spasms. "Deformed," she whispered before biting her tongue. She glanced up in terror, realizing her words could cost her life. But before anyone could move, the sister screamed again. Another push, another cry, but this one sharper. A second twin, smaller, paler, its face sunken as though it had already seen death. The two infants lay side by side, their cries uneven, piercing, echoing off the chamber walls like broken bells. The midwives crossed themselves, whispering, "These are not children, they are curses made flesh." The brother stepped forward, his eyes wild. He refused to look at the deformities, refused to hear the midwives' warnings. Instead, he lifted his chin and declared, "They are heirs, my heirs, our future." But deep inside, even he could not silence the truth. The children's cries were not cries of life. They were omens shrieking in the storm. And outside the castle, the raven finally flew away, leaving behind a sky split open by thunder. They weren't born crying, they were born screaming. These were not children, they were curses made flesh. The storm didn't rage against them, it raged because of them. If you were the midwife that night, would you reveal the deformities to the world, or stay silent to save your life? The storm faded by dawn, but the castle never truly calmed. The air still carried the smell of burnt wax and blood, and in the narrow corridors, silence pressed heavier than stone. The twins had been born not as blessings, but as shadows wrapped in flesh. The first whispers began with the servants. Those who caught only a glimpse of the infant swore they saw limbs bent the wrong way, faces pale as wax, and cries that made their skin crawl. Some claimed the children had been born with eyes that refused to open. Others insisted they heard laughter echo in the chamber, though no one had laughed. By morning, rumors had already reached the village. A merchant swore his cousin in the castle told him the children of sin had arrived. An old woman spat into the fire, muttering that the kingdom would now be haunted. A farmer looked up at the sky, pointing at the red streaks that still lingered from the storm, and whispered, "This is no ordinary family." The church grew uneasy. Priests avoided direct words, but in their sermons they spoke of Sodom, of cursed unions, of dynasties punished by God. And though no names were spoken, every villager knew exactly who they meant. Inside the castle, paranoia grew sharper. Midwives were dismissed, guards replaced, and courtiers warned that loyalty meant silence. But silence only fed suspicion. Why was the queen hidden away for so long? Why were the twins not presented to the court with joy, as tradition demanded? The brother knew the truth, that if the world saw his children, his dynasty would be mocked, his throne weakened. Yet the sister could not bear the burden. She wept at night, whispering that she heard her children's cries even when they slept, cries that sounded less like hunger and more like warning. And then something strange happened. A courier from a rival kingdom arrived, bearing a cryptic message. Even the strongest thrones fall when blood runs backward. The words struck like a blade in the dark. Someone knew. Someone was waiting. The siblings' forbidden union had been hidden in shadows, but their children carried the truth in their very bodies. And shadows, no matter how deep, cannot silence screams forever. Whispers spread faster than armies. These weren't heirs, they were warnings. Even thrones crumble when blood runs backward. If you lived in that kingdom, would you believe the rumors or risk your life to uncover the truth yourself? The twins were hidden from the world, but shadows have a way of escaping locked doors. The midwives who survived that night carried the memory like a wound. They spoke little, but their faces betrayed terror whenever the twins' names were whispered. One of them, an older woman with trembling hands, confessed in whispers to the castle priest. These children, they should not exist. The priest froze. He had heard rumors, yes, but now the truth pressed against him like the weight of a tombstone. He remembered the storm, the screams, the way the chapel's candles had all extinguished at the exact hour of their birth. To him, it was not coincidence. It was divine judgment. Soon a secret circle formed. Midwives, priests, and even a few brave courtiers met in shadows, their meetings hushed, their words sharp with fear. They argued, should the children live, or should they be quietly removed for the good of the kingdom? One priest slammed his hand on the table, his voice trembling. If these heirs ascend, they will bring ruin. Their very blood is poison. But another warned, speak too loudly, and you invite death. The brother would slit our throats before letting anyone touch them. They all knew he was right. The siblings had already silenced servants before. The walls of the castle held secrets buried with bodies, yet the truth refused to die. And then came the omen that shattered their last doubts. During a midnight vigil, a young acolyte swore he saw one of the twins staring at him through the window, even though the child was supposed to be asleep in the chamber. Pale face, hollow eyes, pressing against the glass as though it knew it was being watched. The acolyte fled the chapel, shaking, whispering that the child's eyes were not human. The conspirators' fear deepened. They no longer debated if the twins were cursed. They debated how long the kingdom had before that curse consumed them all. Still they dared not act. Not yet. For the brother watched everything, his paranoia sharpening like a blade, and in his eyes every whisper, every glance, every prayer was an act of treason. The silence around the twins grew louder than screams. Some curses can't be buried. Even silence can be treason. The bloodline wasn't protected, it was feared. If you were in that secret circle, would you risk your life to end the curse, or stay silent and let it grow? The kingdom was not ready for what came next. At first, it was easy to dismiss the twins' oddities as simple deformities, their pallid skin, their mismatched eyes, their fragile frames. But as they grew, so did the unease. Servants began whispering that the twins could know things they had no way of knowing. One chambermaid swore that the young boy spoke her dead husband's name, a name she had never uttered aloud in the castle walls. Another servant claimed the girl predicted the exact hour of her miscarriage, staring at her belly and whispering, "Not tonight, tomorrow." By now, the castle's halls echoed with superstition. Candles snuffed themselves when the twins passed. Dogs refused to enter their chambers, growling at closed doors. The sound of children's laughter at night often came from two places at once, though the twins had not moved an inch from their beds. The midwives who had once delivered them avoided eye contact, crossing themselves whenever the twins entered the room. Priests clutched their rosaries tighter, refusing to baptize them, claiming that no holy water could cleanse what flowed in their veins. But it was the mirror incident that turned whispers into full-blown dread. One morning, a maid polishing the grand mirror saw not two children reflected, but four. Behind the twins stood darker, twisted shapes, the same children but older, grinning with teeth too sharp for humans. When she screamed, the glass shattered, yet the twins didn't flinch. From that day, rumors spread like wildfire. The people stopped calling them heirs. They called them something else, something darker. The children of shadows. They weren't just heirs, they were omens. Some mirrors don't reflect, they reveal. The children didn't need protection, the world did. Do you believe children can be born cursed? Or is this just fear twisting coincidence into horror? By now, the whispers had grown into fire. From the lowest servants to the highest courtiers, fear of the twins had spread like a plague. No one spoke openly, but behind locked doors, plans were being drawn. A secret gathering was held in the cellar of a ruined chapel. Present were priests, midwives, and even a few nobles who feared for the future of the kingdom. Their voices shook as they argued. "We must end this bloodline," hissed one priest, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "If they ascend the throne, the whole realm burns," another noble whispered. The plan was desperate but simple. On the next new moon, the twins would be taken to the river under the cover of night. They would be drowned, their bodies never found, their names erased. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. As the conspirators debated in hushed tones, a sound echoed through the chapel, the sound of laughter. Children's laughter. Every candle flickered, shadows danced across the stone walls, and a voice, thin, soft, unmistakably childlike, whispered from the darkness, "We can hear you." The room fell silent. One by one, the candles extinguished, plunging them into blackness. Panic erupted. Someone screamed. When the torches were finally relit, one of the midwives lay dead on the floor, her face twisted in terror, eyes wide open, her hands clawing at her own throat as if she had been suffocated by invisible hands. The revolt died that night. No one spoke of it again. Those who survived swore oaths of silence, too afraid even to confess their sins. The kingdom carried on as if nothing had happened, but everyone knew the truth. The children already ruled, not with crowns but with fear. The revolt never began because the curse got there first. Some rulers don't need thrones, only silence. The kingdom didn't protect them, it obeyed them. If you heard a child's voice whisper, "We can hear you," in the dark, would you dare breathe another word? For years, the king, the father of the cursed twins, had ruled with iron and cunning. He was the mastermind behind the incestuous union, the man who gambled with bloodlines to preserve power. But one stormy night, his reign came to a chilling end. It began with a scream that echoed through the stone halls. Servants rushed to his chamber, only to find the king lying motionless on the floor beside his bed. His face was pale, his mouth frozen in a silent cry and his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. No wound, no blood, no sign of poison, yet his body was twisted as if he had been gripped by invisible hands and crushed from within. The official story, a sudden heart attack, the kind that could strike any man, but no one believed it, not in a kingdom where every shadow seemed alive. One guard swore he saw the twins outside the king's chamber hours before his death, their pale faces half hidden in the flicker of torchlight. Another servant whispered that the king's last words were, "Keep them away from me." And then came the most chilling rumor of all. A maid who tended to the king's chambers claimed that when she washed his body, tiny handprints, small, childlike, but pressed deep into the skin, covered his chest and throat. Were they real, or just the ramblings of a terrified woman? Nobody knew. But one thing became certain. The king, once the puppeteer, had become the first puppet to be cut from his own strings. The death left the kingdom trembling. Who would rule now? The queen, broken and paranoid, or the twins, barely past childhood but already carrying the weight of dread on their shoulders? The corridors of the castle grew colder after that night. Candles burned lower, doors creaked louder, and in every whispering corner one question spread like fire. Had the children murdered their own father? The king built the curse, and it killed him first. Tiny handprints on a dead man's chest, coincidence or confession? The father's greatest fear was his own blood. If your own children were rumored to have murdered you, would that be fate or justice? The death of the king did not unite the royal family, it shattered it. With the throne suddenly vulnerable, the queen found herself trapped between duty and terror. She had once defended her children fiercely, insisting their strange deformities were a sign of divine purpose. But after the king's mysterious death, something inside her cracked. At night, she refused to sleep in the same wing of the castle as the twins. She claimed she could hear them breathing outside her door, even when guards swore no one was there. The sound was faint, like the raspy giggle of children who knew a secret too terrible to share. Her servants noticed changes. She demanded extra locks on her chambers. She whispered prayers under her breath while eating. Sometimes she flinched when her own children entered the room, as if their presence carried a cold wind that no fire could warm. But fear alone could not protect her. The queen began to form secret alliances. She summoned distant cousins, foreign envoys, even holy men who had once condemned her marriage. Quietly, she asked for help. Quietly, she plotted a way to separate herself from the twins. One midnight meeting with a trusted advisor ended with her voice breaking into sobs. "They are not my children anymore," she confessed. "They are something else." Rumors swirled through the castle. Some said the queen planned to send the twins away to a remote monastery, to bury them in a life of prayer and isolation. Others whispered she wanted them poisoned, the same way her husband might have been. But if she thought her plans were hidden, she was wrong. Because on more than one occasion, she woke in the dead of night to find her chamber door wide open, locks undone, guards missing, and the faint sound of laughter fatting down the corridor. Was it coincidence, or had the children already discovered their mother's betrayal? The queen's paranoia grew into obsession. Her hair whitened early, her eyes hollowed, and she walked the halls clutching rosary beads until her knuckles bled. Still, nothing eased the feeling that she was being watched, not by enemies outside the castle, but by her own flesh and blood. A mother's love turned into a mother's terror. She locked her doors, but the children always found a way in. They weren't her children anymore, they were her curse. If you discovered your children might be plotting against you, would you protect them or destroy them first? The royal court had gathered under the grand vaulted ceiling of the throne room. Golden chandeliers swayed overhead, candles dripping wax like blood onto the polished stone. Nobles wore their finest silks, masks of civility hiding eyes clouded with fear. Everyone knew the kingdom was leaderless, but none dared speak the truth aloud. Then the heavy oak doors creaked open. A silence fell. The twins entered. Their appearance struck like a dagger. Clad in black velvet embroidered with silver threads, they moved slowly, in perfect unison, two small figures whose deformities were half hidden by flowing robes, yet still unmistakable. A slight twist of the spine, fingers too long for their tiny hands, faces eerily symmetrical yet oddly wrong. But it wasn't their bodies that unsettled the court. It was their presence. They did not bow, did not smile. Instead, they walked straight to the throne, their father's empty seat, and placed their pale hands on the gilded armrests. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Then came the moment no one forgot. A nobleman, emboldened by wine perhaps, or by his own desperation, stepped forward. His voice shook as he shouted, "You have no right, the bloodline is broken, you are an abomination." The room froze. The twins turned their heads in unison, their gaze locking onto him. The nobleman staggered back, clutching his throat as if invisible fingers tightened around it. His face turned red, then purple. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He collapsed, unconscious but alive, drool spilling from his lips. The twins said nothing. They simply looked at the queen, their mother, with expressions that seemed to say, "We are in control now." From that day on, no one questioned them openly again. Every noble remembered the sight of a man silenced without a word, without a touch. The throne room did not echo with applause, nor with rebellion, only silence, the kind of silence born from terror. They didn't need to speak, fear was their crown. One gaze turned a nobleman into a choking shadow. The curse had finally taken the throne. If you saw two children silence an entire kingdom with just a look, would you kneel, or would you run? The kingdom had grown restless, but beyond its borders, whispers had turned to mockery. Neighboring rulers called the twins monsters, cursed spawn unfit for rule. To prove their strength, the queen invited ambassadors from rival lands to witness the stability of her court. It was a desperate gamble, and it backfired in ways she could never imagine. The throne room was tense that morning. Nobles lined the walls, knights gripped their swords, and the twins sat on the throne like two shadows stitched to the same crown. Their faces revealed nothing. Then came the foreign ambassador, tall, proud, wrapped in crimson silk. His voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "These children," he sneered, "are not rulers. They are a curse upon your land. Their blood is rotten. Their birth is an insult to God. Do you think other kingdoms will bow to this?" Gasps filled the room. Nobles shifted uneasily, glancing at the queen. But the twins remained still, their pale faces expressionless. For a moment it seemed the insult might pass. Then slowly, one of the twins raised a hand. The ambassador's goblet shattered on the table, spilling wine like blood across the marble floor. His body stiffened. His eyes bulged. And before the horrified court, he was lifted from the ground, feet dangling, throat constricting as though invisible noose tightened around him. The hall erupted in screams. Guards rushed forward but halted as the other twins' gaze swept across them. Torches flickered, chandeliers shook, and the ambassador's body dropped with a sickening crack. His neck bent at an impossible angle. Silence followed, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of spilled wine. The twins looked at each other and smiled, a faint, knowing smile. The queen rose, her face pale as ash, and tried to salvage the moment. "This man insulted the crown. Justice has been served," she declared. But no one believed her words. Everyone knew what had truly happened. A foreign emissary had died not by law, not by blade, but by the unseen hand of cursed children. Word spread across the continent within days. Neighboring rulers did not laugh anymore. They whispered, they feared, and some began to plot. The goblet shattered, and so did his neck. Not by sword, not by poison, by the gaze of children. That day, the curse became international. If you were that ambassador, would you have dared to speak the truth, or kept your mouth shut to keep your neck unbroken? The ambassador's death spread faster than wildfire. By the time his broken body was carried out of the castle, the city below already hummed with whispers. Merchants paused mid-sale, peasants dropped their tools, and beggars muttered prayers as the story passed from lip to trembling lip. The children had killed without touching. At first, people dismissed it as rumor, but then the details multiplied. Some swore they had seen torches flicker in the sky at the exact moment of his death. Others claimed the ambassador's last scream echoed across the city, even for those miles away. Whether truth or exaggeration, one fact remained. Fear no longer lived only in the palace. It had spread to every tavern, every market, every farmhouse. In the villages, mothers clutched their children tighter at night, whispering, "Stay silent, don't draw their gaze." Priests gave sermons in trembling voices, warning that the kingdom was cursed, that sin had invited the devil into the bloodline. Farmers made the sign of the cross whenever a raven flew overhead, muttering that the birds themselves carried the twins' dark eyes. But it wasn't just superstition. Strange events began to ripple through the land. A well in the northern province suddenly turned black, the water reeking of iron and rot. Entire fields withered overnight, crops dying as if scorched by unseen fire. Livestock refused to graze, howling in the night like they saw something humans could not. Each time disaster struck, one phrase echoed, "The children are angry." Meanwhile, within the palace walls, the twins seemed to grow stronger. Their deformities, once mocked, became symbols of dread. Nobles began wearing charms, amulets, anything to ward off the unseen. Yet no talisman could mask the truth. The kingdom no longer belonged to the crown, but to the curse that sat upon it. The queen, pale and gaunt, tried to hold court as usual, but no one listened to her decrees anymore. All eyes drifted toward the throne where the twins sat in silence, their small hands resting on gilded armrests, their eyes watching, always watching. The people had a new name for them now. They no longer called them princes nor heirs. They called them only this: the children of silence. The kingdom had a crown, but fear was the real ruler. Every disaster whispered the same truth. The children were angry. They were no longer heirs. They were the children of silence. If your own rulers could kill without lifting a finger, would you stay loyal or would you run? Far from the glittering palace walls, in the dark taverns and quiet barns of the countryside, whispers grew into plans. Peasants who had lost their crops, soldiers who had deserted their posts, and priests who claimed divine visions began to gather in secrecy. They called themselves the cleansers. Their goal was simple: destroy the cursed twins and restore God's order to the land. They armed themselves not with swords but with faith. Holy relics were smuggled out of churches, salt and ash were carried in sacks, and torches were prepared to burn the devil's children alive. On a moonless night, 24 rebels rode toward the capital. The air was thick, damp, and unnervingly silent. Their horses snorted nervously, as if they too sensed something was wrong. They reached the outskirts of the city just before dawn, but as they crept closer to the gates, the first horror struck. One by one, their torches sputtered and died, though no wind blew. Their horses froze, eyes wide, refusing to take another step. Then came the sound. Children's laughter. Not one voice, two, perfectly synchronized. The rebels turned pale, clutching their charms and crucifixes. A priest muttered a prayer, but before he finished, blood gushed from his nose, his body collapsing lifeless into the dirt. Panic ripped through the group. Then from the shadows of the city gate, two small figures emerged. Cloaked in black, faces hidden, but their eyes glowed faintly in the half-light. The rebels tried to run, but something held them. Their bodies stiffened, arms trembling, legs rooted to the ground as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. One by one they dropped, choking on their own screams. By sunrise, the rebellion was over. Farmers found the bodies scattered across the fields, eyes wide open, mouths twisted in silent terror, as though each had seen something no human should. Their torches, still clutched in their dead hands, had turned to ash. The story spread faster than wildfire. The cleansers had tried to challenge the children, and the children had answered. From that day forward, no one dared to rise again. The curse had proved itself invincible. The torches turned to ash, and so did the rebellion. They marched with faith but fell in silence. The children of silence did not fight, they destroyed. Would you have joined the rebels, knowing you might never return, or would you have bowed your head and lived in fear? The rebellion's failure had left the kingdom paralyzed, but the nobles knew one truth: bloodlines must continue. A throne without heirs meant weakness, and weakness invited invasion. So whispers began in the council chambers: we must marry the twins. The queen resisted at first. Her face hollow, her voice trembling, she tried to argue that they were too young, too strange, too feared. But her advisors pressed harder. A wedding will show strength. A union will legitimize the crown. Without it, foreign armies will descend upon us. At last she relented. Plans were drawn, invitations written, envoys dispatched. A royal wedding was announced. The reaction across the kingdom was not joy, but dread. In villages, mothers wept, fearing their daughters might be chosen as sacrifices in silks. In the city, whispers turned darker. To marry them is to curse your womb. To lie with them is to invite death. Superstition twisted into terror. Midwives swore that any union with the twins would bring forth monsters. Priests warned of another Sodom, a kingdom destroyed not by war but by sin. Still, the preparations continued. The palace shimmered with forced celebration, banners unfurled, musicians rehearsed, bakers prepared towering cakes. Yet beneath the gilded surface, every step felt like a funeral procession. Then came the most chilling part. Suitors began to arrive, nobles from distant lands seeking alliances, though most came reluctantly, their smiles thin and their eyes haunted. One young lord whispered to his servant, "I'd rather face the gallows than share a bed with them." Days later, he vanished without a trace. And the twins? They said nothing. They only watched. During banquets, they sat side by side, hands clasped, their gaze sweeping the room like twin predators studying prey. When asked if they looked forward to the wedding, one of them finally spoke, a soft, sing-song voice that silenced the hall. "Marriage means nothing. We already belong to each other." The words struck like a hammer. Nobles averted their eyes, priests crossed themselves, and even the queen turned pale. The wedding had not yet begun, but already it felt less like a union and more like a curse carved into destiny. This wasn't a wedding, it was a funeral dressed in gold. To marry them was to marry the curse. They said it calmly, "We already belong to each other." If you were chosen to marry into a cursed bloodline, would you accept for power or risk death by refusing? The palace gleamed with forced joy. Chandeliers blazed, silk banners shimmered, and trumpets announced the approach of the cursed wedding. Yet, under the glitter, unease lingered like a rotting stench. It was the eve of the ceremony when the first omen appeared. A servant carrying trays of wine claimed he saw the twins whispering in a tongue unknown to any priest or scholar. Their lips moved in perfect unison, chanting something soft yet venomous. The moment they stopped, every candle in the banquet hall sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. When light returned, a horror awaited them. The towering wedding cake, a masterpiece sculpted for weeks, had collapsed into itself, its layers crushed and oozing red jam like bleeding flesh. Bakers swore it was impossible. Nobles muttered it was a sign. But that was only the beginning. On the morning of the wedding, the royal chapel was found desecrated. Statues of saints lay shattered on the floor, their faces broken, their marble eyes gouged out. At the altar, where the vows were meant to be exchanged, someone had scrawled in crimson letters, "You cannot bind what is already won." The queen wept, demanding the words be scrubbed away, but no amount of washing could erase the stain. The stone seemed to drink the blood deeper each time. And then came the final omen. As the guests arrived, a great flock of blackbirds descended upon the palace gardens. They circled above the chapel in a shrieking storm, blotting out the sun. When they landed, it was not on trees but on the roof of the chapel itself, as though waiting for carrion. Their caws echoed like mocking laughter, drowning out the wedding bells. The people whispered, "The gods reject this union. The earth itself rejects it." Yet the council pressed forward. The banners still hung, the candles still burned, and the musicians still played trembling notes. But beneath it all, one truth was undeniable. The wedding was no longer a celebration. It was a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. You cannot bind what is already won. The cake bled before the vows were spoken. Even the birds came to feast, not celebrate. If you saw these omens before a royal wedding, would you dare attend, or flee before the first vow was spoken? The chapel glowed with thousands of candles, yet the air was colder than a grave. Nobles sat stiff in their velvet seats, priests clutched their scriptures, and the queen's hands trembled as she held her rosary. Outside, the blackbirds screamed like a funeral choir. At the altar, the twins stood side by side, dressed in shimmering white, their faces pale as wax. They didn't look like a bride and groom. They looked like two reflections of the same shadow. The archbishop's voice cracked as he began the sacred rite. "Do you, Alexander, take?" But he stopped. The boy had already answered. His voice rang out, clear, strong, unnatural. "I do." The girl turned, eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. Before the archbishop could speak again, she whispered, almost in unison with him, "I do." Gasps filled the chapel. The vows weren't supposed to overlap. The priest tried again, his hands shaking, but the twins ignored him. They spoke together now, their words a perfect mirror. "We bind ourselves not by law, not by faith, but by blood. What was one shall remain one." The crowd stirred in horror. Some nobles clutched their children, others made the sign of the cross, but no one dared move. Then came the impossible. The moment the rings were exchanged, the chapel doors slammed shut on their own. Every candle burst into black smoke. And in the darkness, the twins' voices echoed not like children, but like 1,000 whispers layered together, ancient and eternal. "You cannot stop what has already begun." When the lights returned, the archbishop lay slumped over the altar dead, his skin gray, his eyes hollow. The rings on the twins' hands glowed faintly, as though alive. The queen screamed, the courtiers fled, but the twins only smiled, holding hands as though nothing had happened. The wedding was complete, not blessed by God, but sealed by something far older. The priest died before the kiss. Two voices, one vow, no escape. Not a marriage, a covenant. If a wedding vow killed the priest before your eyes, would you call it holy, or a curse carved in blood? The banquet hall glittered with gold, chandeliers blazing like miniature suns. Servants rushed in with silver trays piled high, roasted pheasants, honeyed figs, goblets of crimson wine. But despite the splendor, the room stank of fear. Every noble whispered, every glance darted to the twins at the head table. Their hands never separated. They didn't eat. They didn't blink. They only stared at each guest, one by one, as if memorizing who would live and who would die. The king tried to laugh, raising his cup. "To the union of my children, may their bond bring eternal strength to the throne." His voice cracked, but the musicians quickly struck their violins to drown out the unease. And then it happened. One of the nobles, Lord Vamer, lifted his goblet to toast. He barely touched the wine to his lips before he collapsed, face smashing into the roasted boar. His skin turned blue, his veins blackened, and a choking gargle echoed across the hall. Screams erupted. Women clutched their pearls, men shoved back chairs, servants dropped platters. The queen rose in horror. "Stop the feast, he's been poisoned." But the twins didn't move. Instead, they turned their heads toward each other and smiled, as though sharing a secret. Lord Vamer's body twitched once, then lay still. The king's face went pale. He barked orders, "Search the kitchens, find the traitor." Guards stormed off, blades drawn. But deep down, everyone in that hall knew the truth. This wasn't the work of a cook or a servant. This was the curse claiming its first victim. And still the twins never ate, never drank. They only whispered to each other, their words too soft to catch. But one servant swore he heard a single phrase. "One down, many to go." The feast ended in chaos. Half the nobles fled that night, swearing never to return. Yet the king forced the doors shut, declaring no one would leave until loyalty was proven. And so the banquet became a prison. Fear sat heavier than the food on every table. Every cup of wine trembled in the hand that held it. Every bite felt like a gamble with death. The wedding had begun with a corpse on the altar. Now, the marriage feast carried its first sacrifice, and the kingdom realized with horror this wasn't just a curse. It was a hunger. The feast became a funeral. One sip, one scream, one death. Not poisoned food, poisoned blood. Would you dare eat at a table where every bite could be your last? The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a thundering echo. Guards lined them, swords drawn, faces blank as stone. The king's voice carried across the hall, shaky but merciless. "No one leaves until we find the traitor." But deep inside, everyone knew the traitor wasn't outside the room. The curse was already seated at the head table. The chandeliers flickered. Shadows stretched like claws across the marble floor. Servants tried to clear the feast, but the smell of Lord Vamer's death lingered, sour and metallic, like rotten iron in the air. That night no one slept. The nobles were herded into guest chambers, locked from the outside for their safety. But the palace wasn't protection. It was a cage. The hallways groaned with the sound of old wood, doors creaking when no one touched them. Some swore they heard children's laughter, soft, echoing, inhuman. By midnight, another scream shattered the silence. A young noblewoman, Lady Seraphine, was found in her chamber, her face twisted in terror, her hands clawing at her throat as though she had been strangled by invisible fingers. No wounds, no blood, just fear frozen into her skin. The queen broke down, sobbing. The king roared with rage, but his commands grew desperate, almost pathetic. He accused guards, servants, even priests, yet every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the twins. They hadn't moved since the feast. They sat at the high table still, hands clasped, whispering in their eerie unison. Their plates remained untouched. One brave lord confronted them. "What have you done to us?" His voice echoed through the chamber. The boy twin lifted his head, finally speaking aloud. His tone was calm, cold, final. "We don't kill, we only unlock what was already inside." A chill swept through the room, because deep down, every noble knew the truth, their power, their greed, their hidden sins had always been there. The twins were simply pulling the strings that revealed them. By dawn, two corpses lay in the palace, no killer found, no exit allowed. The palace was no longer a seat of power, it was a hunting ground. The palace doors didn't lock them in, the curse did. Not murder, revelation. Every sunrise meant fewer survivors. If you were trapped in a cursed palace where nobles died one by one each night, who would you trust, the guards, the king, or no one at all? The second night fell heavy on the palace, as though the sky itself pressed down to smother the earth. Clouds swallowed the moon. No stars dared shine. Inside, the nobles gathered in the grand hall, forced by the king to remain together for safety. But there was no safety. Only eyes darting, whispers hissing, and hearts pounding against ribcage like prison bars. The twins sat again at the head table, their hands intertwined, their faces still as masks. They had become the silent center of every terrified gaze. Then the whispers began. "Did you see? Lady Seraphine had debts. And Lord Vamer, he betrayed the king once before. They weren't random, they were guilty." The idea spread like wildfire. What if the twins weren't simply killing? What if they were choosing? At midnight the music started. No musicians played, yet the sound of a lullaby drifted through the hall. Thin, haunting, like a child humming in the dark. Everyone froze. One by one the candles snuffed out, the hall drowned in shadows. And when the light flared back to life, another body lay on the marble floor. Sir Aldrich, a knight with a reputation for cruelty. His throat was slashed, though no weapon was found, and his blood formed a perfect circle around him, as though drawn by careful hands. The nobles panicked, screaming, but the twins rose at last. The girl's voice cut through the chaos, soft yet commanding. "We do not kill the innocent, we only pass judgment." The boy added, his tone like steel. "Confess your sins, and perhaps you will be spared." The hall erupted into arguments, accusations, and desperate bargains. Some nobles began confessing aloud, spilling secrets of bribery, betrayal, and adultery, anything to prove they were worthy of mercy. Others refused, claiming innocence, but their trembling hands betrayed their fear. The king slammed his fist against the table, roaring, "Enough! I am your ruler, not these children." But even as he spoke, his voice trembled. For the first time, everyone saw it, he was not the one in control anymore. The twins were. And the nobles realized with horror, this wasn't a banquet. This was a courtroom. The palace had become their trial, and the twins were both judge and executioner. Confession meant survival, silence meant death. Not killers, but judges. The palace wasn't a feast hall, it was a courtroom. If your life depended on confessing your darkest sin to cursed children, would you tell the truth or gamble with silence? By the third night, whispers had turned into plans. Fear had become rage. In a dimly lit chamber, 6 nobles gathered in secret. Their faces were pale, their voices hushed, but their words dripped with desperation. We can't keep waiting to die. If they are the curse, we end them and this ends with it. They're only children. But no one truly believed that last sentence. They smuggled daggers from the kitchens, tore iron bars from windows to fashion spears. Every clang of metal echoed like a heartbeat, faster, louder, as though the palace itself listened. At midnight, they made their move. The hall was silent, nobles trembling at the tables when suddenly a scream of defiance. The rebels rushed the dais where the twins sat, their blades flashing in the candlelight. The girl did not flinch. The boy did not rise. They only looked at the rebels with calm, cold eyes. And then the chandeliers above exploded. Shards of glass and flame rained down. The rebels screamed as the fire caught their clothes, as invisible hands wrenched their weapons away. One noble was slammed against the wall, bones snapping like twigs. Another dropped his dagger, clutching his throat as though strangled by unseen fingers. The leader made it within a breath of the twins, his dagger raised high, but the boy finally moved. He raised a single hand. The man froze mid-strike, his body contorting, his scream muffled as blood poured from his eyes. He collapsed lifeless at their feet. The girl whispered, her voice like silk over steel. Rebellion is not bravery, it is confession. The other rebels lay dead or broken on the marble floor, their blood painting patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if drawn into symbols only the twins could understand. Silence swallowed the hall. The surviving nobles cowered in corners, too afraid to breathe. Even the king had risen from his throne, his face white with terror, his crown slipping from his brow. The twins sat back down, hand in hand as if nothing had happened. But everyone else knew the curse could not be fought. The twins were untouchable, and now rebellion itself had become another sin to be judged. The rebellion died before it began. Not children, executioners. Every blade turned against its master. If you were trapped with cursed siblings who could kill with a glance, would you dare rebel or bow and beg for mercy? The palace no longer buzzed with music or laughter. It pulsed with whispers, venomous, desperate, each word a dagger pointed at another throat. In the dining hall, nobles sat in tense silence, eyes darting like trapped animals. Every cough, every trembling hand became evidence. Every glance felt like accusation. It started with Lady Mirabelle. She stood abruptly, pointing a jeweled finger at Lord Castor. He has bribed mercenaries to betray the crown. He is guilty. Take him. The twins tilted their heads, their eyes gleaming faintly in the candlelight. They said nothing. But that silence was enough. Guards dragged Lord Castor to the center. He shouted, he begged, but no one defended him. Moments later, his body lay stiff on the floor, his lips purple, his veins blackened. The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles began shouting over one another, exposing affairs, thefts, hidden debts, and treasons long buried. The air reeked of sweat, fear, and desperation. Lady Althea poisoned her husband. Lord Bennet plots with foreign kings. Sir Garrick sold secrets for gold. Each accusation was like blood in the water, and the twins they watched, silent, almost amused. Their faint smiles widened as noble after noble fell, not by sword, not by curse, but by betrayal. By midnight, 3 more corpses lay cooling on the marble floor. The king tried to silence them, slamming his goblet on the table. Enough, you disgrace this court. But even his voice quivered, for he knew if anyone revealed his darkest sins, his reign would end before dawn. The queen, pale and trembling, whispered to herself, "They're turning us against one another." But perhaps the cruelest twist was this. No one knew if the twins even needed to kill anymore. The nobles were destroying themselves, clawing each other apart in their hunger to survive. The curse had changed. It wasn't just death in the night. It was suspicion, betrayal, and paranoia, eating the palace alive from within. Betrayal became the new currency of survival. They didn't need to kill. The nobles did it for them. The curse wasn't just blood, it was fear. If you were trapped in a palace where confession meant survival, but silence meant death, would you expose your darkest secret, or sacrifice someone else to save yourself? The palace library had been locked for years, its doors chained by royal decree. Dust clung to its shelves like cobwebs of time, and no servant dared enter. But in desperation, a group of nobles pried it open, hopping for answers. Inside, the air was suffocating, thick with the musk of forgotten parchment and mold. The candles flickered weakly, casting monstrous shadows across stacks of scrolls. The silence was so heavy that even the sound of turning a page felt like blasphemy. It was Lord Darius who found it, a cracked leather tome bound with iron clasps. Its pages were yellowed, its ink dark as dried blood, and on its first leaf was written in ancient script: "When siblings unite as one, blood shall twist and kingdom shatter. From their womb shall rise the mirrored heirs, not of man nor God, but of the curse that feeds on sin." Gasps filled the chamber. Some dropped the book immediately, claiming it was heresy, but others leaned closer, desperate for truth. The text went further, chilling each reader to the bone. "They shall sit not as children, but as judge and executioner. Each sin revealed shall feed their reign. Each betrayal shall make them stronger. And when the crown itself is stained, the dynasty shall drown in its own blood." The nobles froze. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't madness. This, all of it, had been foretold. Suddenly, the doors to the library slammed shut. A gust of cold air swept through, extinguishing the candles. The only light was from the moon, streaming through the tall windows, illuminating the twins who now stood in the doorway. They hadn't been there a moment before. The girl spoke first, her voice like silk over broken glass. "You search for answers." The boy followed, his tone a whisper that chilled every spine. "But truth is not salvation, it is a sentence." Before anyone could move, Lord Darius, the one who had opened the tome, clutched his chest, gasped, and collapsed. The prophecy book slipped from his hands, its pages flipping wildly as though blown by an invisible storm. When silence fell again, the twins smiled faintly. "You've read it, now you understand. This is not a curse, it is destiny." And with that, they vanished back into the shadows, leaving the nobles trembling with a single, horrifying realization. This wasn't something they could fight. It was something that had been written long before they were even born. It wasn't a curse, it was destiny. The prophecy had always known their names. Not children, not human, fate made flesh. If you discovered a prophecy that foretold your death, would you fight it, or accept that destiny had already sealed your fate? The trial of the Wooten siblings was unlike anything the townsfolk had ever seen. In a courthouse that creaked with history, every seat was filled, every corridor packed with men and women desperate to witness the spectacle. The air buzzed with whispers, as if each person was both judge and jury, ready to decide the fate of the accused. The siblings entered, not as a broken family, but as a united front, their hands nearly brushing, as though even here, before the law, they refused to be separated. The charges were read aloud, their words echoing like thunder in the hall: incest, conspiracy, and moral corruption. Each accusation struck like a hammer, yet the siblings did not flinch. Instead, Evangeline turned her gaze to the crowd, her expression unreadable but defiant, as though daring them to pass judgment on what they could never truly understand. Some in the gallery gasped, others muttered prayers, as if shielding themselves from the curse they believed was unfolding in front of them. Witnesses were called, neighbors who had seen flickers of candlelight in the wrong hours of the night, midwives who whispered about the strange tension in Evangeline's body, and even servants who spoke of overheard conversations that hinted at forbidden intimacy. Each testimony was a dagger, each word sharpening the blade of public hatred. But then came the defense. Their lawyer painted a different picture, of siblings orphaned too young, of trauma that had forged an unbreakable bond, of whispers twisted into accusations by envy and fear. The courtroom split, some believed, others spat in disgust. And yet the trial was more than just about law. It was theater. Every glance, every tremble of Evangeline's hands, every sharp breath from her brother was dissected by the crowd, retold in hushed tones across the county that night. The siblings weren't just defendants. They were legends being written in real time, cursed or blessed depending on who you asked. As the day drew to a close, the judge's gavel slammed down, but no verdict came. Instead, the court recessed, the air crackling with unresolved tension. Crowds spilled into the streets, arguing, shouting, even fighting over what they had witnessed. For the first time, the town itself was on trial, its morals, its fears, its boundaries between rumor and truth. But behind those courthouse doors, the siblings shared a brief moment alone, a quiet exchange of, but what if the verdict wasn't justice at all, but a sentence written by fear itself? The final day of the trial dawned under a blood-red sunrise, as though the heavens themselves were preparing to pass judgment. The courthouse groaned beneath the weight of bodies pressed into every corner, the air heavy with the stink of sweat, fear, and morbid anticipation. No one came for justice anymore. They came for the spectacle, for the promise that today, the scandal that had poisoned their town would finally meet its end. The judge, stern and gray, entered with the solemnity of a man about to carve history into stone. The siblings sat together once again, eyes locked not on him, but on each other, as if the world outside that connection was irrelevant. The silence was suffocating. Every cough, every shuffle of boots echoed like cannon fire in the stillness. Then the gavel slammed. The verdict was to be read. The clerk's trembling voice broke the silence. On the charge of incest, the words dragged like chains, each syllable pulling the crowd closer to eruption. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the first verdict rang out. Guilty. Murmurs of satisfaction rolled like thunder, but the clerk wasn't finished. On the charge of conspiracy and corruption of morals, another guilty. The air split into cheers and curses, some weeping with relief, others demanding harsher punishment. Evangeline's face remained carved from stone. Her brother clenched his fists, but he did not cry out. To them, the verdict was not a revelation. They had known all along how this story would end. Yet still, their silence enraged the crowd. Shouts rose, "Hang them! Burn the wickedness from our town!" The judge banged his gavel, but the mob had tasted blood, and it would not be quieted. Then came the sentence: public humiliation and imprisonment. A punishment meant not only to confine their bodies, but to etch their shame into memory, to make them a warning for generations. Some were furious it wasn't death. Others whispered that prison walls could not contain the curse these siblings carried. Outside, the crowd boiled into near riot, as if the very foundation of morality had been placed on trial and no verdict could ever satisfy. As guards led the siblings away, Evangeline paused, just long enough to look back at the sea of faces twisted with rage. She did not speak, but her eyes told a story. They might bury her body, but they would never bury her defiance. And that silent vow would prove far more dangerous than any crime she had been accused of. But what happened inside that prison would ignite an even darker chapter. The prison gates groaned open like the jaws of a beast, ready to swallow them whole. A damp stench of mildew and human decay clung to the air, so thick it seemed to crawl into the lungs of anyone who entered. Chains rattled. Rats skittered across the stone floor, their claws scratching against the silence, as if mocking the prisoners who could not escape. This was no mere confinement. This was a tomb for the living. The siblings were dragged inside, their names stripped from them, reduced now to numbers etched in crude chalk across their cell doors. The guards treated them not as criminals but as cursed creatures, keeping their distance, whispering rumors that their blood carried sickness, that to touch them was to invite deformity. Already, fear had given them a power greater than freedom ever could. Their cell was small, no wider than a coffin laid sideways. The stone was wet to the touch, slimy with moss, and the ceiling dripped endlessly, every droplet echoing like a slow, eternal clock. Evangeline sat against the wall, her dark hair clinging to her face, her eyes glowing with a fire that prison could not extinguish. Her brother paced the length of the cell, each turn carving grooves into the floor, his silence more terrifying than any scream. But prison walls do not contain secrets, they amplify them. Whispers spread through the corridors. Some said the twins had been born not deformed but cursed by their parents' sins. Others swore the children had been seen alive, hidden in shadow, their twisted bodies used as proof of divine wrath. Guards argued about which story was true, their paranoia feeding the siblings' legend even further. One night, as thunder cracked outside and rain pounded the prison roof like a war drum, a guard swore he heard chanting from their cell. Not prayers, something darker, rhythms that echoed like old rituals spoken in tones that shook the marrow. When he peered inside, he found them sitting hand in hand, eyes closed, their lips moving in perfect unison. He ran, but the sound followed him down the corridor. The town wanted justice. The prison whispered of damnation. But inside the cell, the siblings were weaving something else, something unseen, something that made even stone walls tremble. But what if the prison wasn't their punishment, but their stage for the final act? The prison was meant to break them, but instead, it began to break the men who guarded them. At first, it was small things. A guard swore he heard his own name whispered from inside the cell when no one else was near. Another claimed he saw the shadow of a child crawling along the wall, though the twins had no visitors. The others laughed it off, saying it was just the damp air and too many sleepless nights. But the laughter died quickly when one guard went missing. He had been stationed outside their cell during the storm. The next morning, only his lantern was found, still burning on the floor, its flame flickering wildly as if gasping for air. The iron door to the siblings' cell was still locked tight. There was no trace of him inside. No blood, no struggle, just gone. Fear spread like plague through the prison. Guards refused to take night shifts near the siblings. Some began crossing themselves whenever they walked past, but the warden, desperate to maintain control, ordered double watches and harsher treatment. He thought cruelty would break their influence. He was wrong. One evening, Evangeline looked directly at a guard, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "Your wife is with child, but not yours." The man froze. No one had spoken of his wife's condition, and yet she was right. His hands shook so badly he dropped his keys, the sound echoing like a death knell through the corridor. The siblings were no longer prisoners. They were puppeteers, pulling strings through silence, through fear, through secrets no one knew they had. And the guards began to unravel. Then came the second disappearance. This time, a guard's scream ripped through the stone halls, followed by a crashing of chains. When others rushed to the source, they found only his uniform, neatly folded in the corner of the passage. His body was never recovered. The prison, meant to confine them, was transforming into a stage of horror, and the town outside began to whisper. Maybe the siblings were not cursed by blood, maybe they were the curse itself. But when the townsfolk demanded answers, what they uncovered was even darker. While the prison guards trembled in silence, the town outside began to rot under the weight of rumors. What was supposed to be a place of safety, a barrier keeping the siblings away from decent folk, soon became a beacon of fear. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. "Stay away from the prison walls, or their curse will follow you home." Merchants claimed their coins felt heavier, as though blood had stained the silver itself. Even the church pews stood emptier each week. for some believed prayers could not compete with whatever dwelled inside those stone cells. Then came the strange accidents. A farmer's cow gave birth to a calf with twisted legs. A midwife delivered a child who did not survive, its features eerily similar to the stories of the siblings' own twins. A drunken blacksmith swore he saw Evangeline's face reflected in the forge fire, smiling back at him. Fear began to ripple through the town like a sickness. Were these coincidences, or was their influence bleeding through the prison walls? The prison itself became a site of pilgrimage. Crowds gathered outside the gates at night, clutching lanterns and crucifixes, daring each other to listen for the whispers said to rise from the stones. Some swore they heard crying infants. Others claimed they saw shadows dancing against the barred windows, shapes too twisted to belong to any human. The more people came, the more the legend grew. And yet here lay the darkest twist. The siblings thrived on it. The guards noticed their health improving, their defiance growing. In confinement, most prisoners grew frail and broken, but Evangeline and her brother, their skin seemed to glow with vitality, their eyes sharper, their words more venomous. It was as though the fear outside was feeding them, giving them strength that iron chains could not contain. When one priest dared to declare it nothing but superstition, his voice cracked mid-sermon. He fell into a coughing fit so violent he collapsed before the altar. By dawn, he was dead. To the townsfolk, it was not illness, it was punishment. The curse of the siblings, reaching even into holy ground. The town no longer debated whether the siblings were guilty of sin. That question was dead. What haunted everyone now was darker. Were the siblings merely victims of blood and choice, or had something far older, far hungrier chosen them? And then, a letter surfaced from inside the prison that revealed their true intentions. It began with a single slip of parchment, smuggled out of the prison by a trembling guard who swore it had been slid beneath his boot in the dead of night. At first, no one believed him. But when the letter was read aloud, the air in the courtroom turned colder, as though the words themselves carried frost. The handwriting was unmistakable, Evangeline's elegant and sharp, every stroke like a blade. The message was simple and terrifying. You cannot cage us, the walls are ours, the fear is ours, and when the chains rot we will not escape, we will be welcomed. The town erupted in panic. Was it a threat of rebellion, a prophecy, or worse, an invitation? Authorities searched the prison, ransacking every stone and shadow for more letters, and they found them. Dozens. Hidden in cracks, stuffed into straw mattresses, even folded inside the hollow bones of food scraps tossed back from their meals. Each one contained secrets, details of guards, families, hidden sins, and whispered crimes only those involved should have known. How did the siblings know? Had they bribed someone? Or were they pulling knowledge from some place darker, some unseen well of forbidden insight? The letters didn't just predict events, they exposed them. A letter claimed one merchant had poisoned his competitor's well. Days later, the merchant's own wife confessed it in hysteria. Another letter accused a judge of bedding his servant girl. The very next week, she gave birth in shame. The prison, meant to silence the siblings, had instead become their pulpit. Through the letters, they ruled the town like shadow monarchs, their words sharper than swords, their revelations more destructive than any riot. And the people, whether they hated or feared them, were listening. But one letter chilled the blood more than all the rest. It spoke not of others, but of themselves. The children live, the curse breathes, and when the time comes they will walk among you. The crowd froze in horror. The twins, long believed dead, were they still alive, hidden, or had their spirits never left? No one could agree. Yet one thing became clear: the siblings were not waiting to escape. They were preparing to unleash something far worse. And when the prison warden uncovered the truth behind that claim, the entire town nearly burned. The prison warden had endured years of rumors, riots, and whispers about curses, but the moment he read that final letter, his veins turned to ice. The children live. The words echoed in his skull, gnawing at his sanity. If the twins were alive, it meant the trial had been a lie. If they were dead, it meant the siblings had found a way to make corpses speak. Neither answer was safe. Driven by dread, the warden began his own secret investigation. By lantern light, he pored over old trial records, birth registries, and parish death logs. Something was wrong. The burial of the twins had never been officially recorded. No grave markers, no priest's blessing, only a vague note in the courthouse ledger, disposed quietly. That word disposed haunted him. He ordered the prison's gravedigger, a man with trembling hands and a mouth that never stopped muttering, to lead him to where the infants were supposedly buried. The man hesitated, then confessed he had never buried them at all. He had been told to carry two small wooden boxes out beyond the cemetery walls, but before he could finish, his voice broke, and he swore the boxes moved on their own. The warden, pale as death, demanded to know what became of them. The gravedigger swore he left the boxes at the edge of the forest, too afraid to dig. He claimed he heard crying behind him as he fled, though he dared not look back. The warden's world tilted. If this was true, then the children had never been put to rest. Whether living or not, their fate was tied to the forest, dark, endless, and whisper. And what the warden discovered next would push the entire town to the brink of hysteria. By dawn, the warden's secret could not be contained. A single rumor escaped his lips to a trusted guard, and within hours it spread like wildfire through the streets. The twins live. Whether truth or madness, the words poisoned the town's fragile order. Merchants shuttered their shops, refusing to trade near the prison walls. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers under their breath. The church bells rang out not in worship but in warning, as if tolling for a disaster that had not yet arrived. Even the most rational townsfolk found themselves glancing at shadows, wondering if twisted little figures skulked there, waiting to crawl into their homes. Then came the hysteria. A farmer swore he saw two small, malformed silhouettes darting through his fields at twilight, their laughter echoing like broken glass. A widow claimed she woke to find muddy footprints, tiny, deformed, beside her bed. A group of hunters returned from the forest, pale and trembling, after stumbling upon a pair of small wooden boxes, torn open from the inside. Inside the moss and dirt lay scraps of cloth, stained with something too dark to be mud. The warden tried to silence these tales, but every denial only fueled suspicion. The townsfolk began to gather outside the prison gates nightly, lanterns swaying like restless fireflies. They screamed curses, demanded answers, demanded to see the siblings. Fear turned to rage, rage to violence. Windows shattered, torches were raised. The line between hysteria and revolt was thinning. Inside the cell, Evangeline watched the mob through a slit in the wall, her face lit by the flickering glow of fire outside. She leaned close to her brother and whispered words no guard could hear, but every guard swore they felt them, crawling across their skin like insects. Whatever she said, it made him smile. For the first time since their imprisonment, he smiled. The warden stood in his office, staring at the town spiraling into chaos, knowing one truth: the siblings didn't need to escape. They had already conquered. And then a scream tore through the night, not from the prison but from the town square itself. A child's scream. What the townsfolk found at the source of that scream shattered what little sanity they had left. The scream from the town square sliced through the night like a knife, pulling every villager from their homes. Lanterns swung wildly as people rushed toward the sound, their breath fogging in the cold air, their hearts hammering as if in unison. By the time they arrived, a circle had already formed, faces pale, eyes wide, every voice silenced by the horror before them. In the center of the square lay a cradle. No one knew who had placed it there. Its wood was old, splintered, and wet from the rain, but the blanket inside was fresh, spotless white. And beneath that blanket, movement. A baby's cry rang out, high-pitched, thin, almost human, but twisted by something unnatural. When a woman finally found the courage to lift the cloth, she dropped it with a shriek. Inside was not one child but two, conjoined at the chest, their limbs twisted, their eyes cloudy as milk. They wailed in unison, their small bodies writhing as though in pain, yet their mouths curved upward into something that almost resembled a smile. The crowd staggered back, some crossing themselves, others vomiting onto the cobblestones. Someone shouted, "It's them, the twins, the cursed children." The word spread like fire. Fear turned to frenzy. Rocks were hurled, torches raised, but every attempt to strike the cradle was met with failure. Each man who lifted a hand dropped his weapon, clutching his chest in sudden agony. It was as though the infants themselves rejected violence, demanding not death but worship. Panic exploded. Mothers dragged their children home, weeping. Men shouted for the cradle to be burned, while others argued it must be taken to the church, that perhaps the infants could be saved. Yet no one dared to touch them again. The cradle sat in the square, rocking gently though no wind stirred. And then silence. The crying ceased. The twins stared at the crowd, their milky eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light. A single word seemed to hang in the air, though no lips had spoken it. Ours. The people fled, leaving the cradle behind, but none could sleep. Every man, woman, and child felt the same dread. The curse had left the prison. It now lived in their square, in their town, in their homes. But what happened the following morning would prove that the nightmare was only beginning. When dawn broke, the town square was eerily quiet. Birds refused to sing, and the usual clatter of hooves and wagons was absent, as if the entire town held its breath. People crept from their homes, clutching rosaries and charms, their eyes drawn to the spot where the cradle had stood. It was gone. The cobblestones where it had rested were wet with dew, yet the outline of the cradle remained in the dust as though burned into the stone itself. No footprints surrounded it, no drag marks, nothing. The cradle and the twins within had vanished into thin air. The panic that followed was uncontrollable. Some swore the infants had been taken by demons, others that they had walked away on their own, crawling into the forest to finish what their parents had begun. A few claimed they had heard crying outside their own windows in the night, faint and fleeting, as if the children had been searching for new homes. The council convened in desperation. Their debates turned into screaming matches. Should the prison siblings be executed at once? Should the town be abandoned? One elder suggested burning the entire square to purge the stain of evil. Another shouted that such fire would only feed the curse. Meanwhile, hysteria twisted into violence. Neighbors accused one another of harboring the cursed infants. A baker's shop was torched after someone claimed to see small handprints in flour across his counter. A midwife was dragged into the street, beaten for allegedly conspiring with Evangeline to protect the offspring. The town was eating itself alive. And inside the prison, the siblings remained silent. They did not speak. They did not rise. But when the warden checked their cell that morning, his blood ran cold. On the damp wall, traced in some dark, sticky substance, were words written in perfect unison. "They are free." The warden staggered back, heart pounding, as a new terror gripped him. The children weren't just alive. They weren't just free. They were moving with purpose. And what followed was not survival, but a siege unlike anything the town had ever endured. The siege began quietly, like a whisper spreading through locked doors and shuttered windows. At first, it was livestock found dead at dawn, cows with their throats slit, chickens scattered in pieces across the dirt, pigs left skinned as though by unseen hands. The farmers swore they had heard crying in the night, the sound of infants just outside their barns, but when they ran to look, nothing was there. Then came the knocking. At midnight, every home in the square reported the same thing, two soft knocks at the door. Always two, never three, never one. Families huddled inside, clutching each other, praying the wood would hold. Those foolish enough to answer said they saw nothing but a cradle swaying gently on their doorstep, though the air was thick with the smell of milk gone sour. The fear grew unbearable. Mothers refused to rock their own children. afraid the sound of lullabies would draw the cursed twins closer. Fathers patrolled with lanterns and rifles, though none dared venture near the prison. The guards themselves reported hearing giggles echoing down the corridors, even though the prison cells remained sealed. On the fourth night, the siege turned violent. The church bell began ringing on its own, tolling 13 times though no one had pulled the rope. Doors slammed open against their locks, and windows shattered inward as if struck by invisible stones. In the chaos, one truth became undeniable. The town wasn't under attack from outside forces. It was crumbling from within. Panic seized the square as families fled in every direction, convinced the infants were following them. One old woman swore she saw them crawling up the church steeple in the moonlight, their eyes glowing pale and their tiny mouths chanting prayers backwards. Another swore she awoke to find her own baby gone from its crib, replaced by nothing but 2 dolls carved crudely from bone. By morning, the town was unrecognizable, shops abandoned, doors left swinging open, the marketplace empty as if every soul had been driven into hiding. And yet, from the shadows of the forest beyond, villagers whispered they could still hear it, the faint creak of a cradle, rocking endlessly just out of sight. But the true horror was not the siege itself. It was the terrifying discovery of who was leading it. At first, the townsfolk believed the infants were mindless apparitions, cursed souls doomed to wander without direction. But the siege revealed a chilling flaw in that belief. The attacks weren't random. They were coordinated. Every strike, every haunting, every twisted omen followed a pattern as though someone, or something, was pulling the strings. The truth came when a group of desperate men stormed the prison, hoping to end the curse by destroying the very cradle where the twins had first appeared. They broke through the iron gates, lanterns shaking in their hands, and descended into the cold stone corridors. At the heart of the prison, they found the cradle overturned, its wood blackened with rot, but it wasn't empty. Sitting beside it was a woman. Her eyes were pale as milk, her dress tattered and soaked with old blood. Some swore she was the mother of the twins, long dead and buried in an unmarked grave. Others,